One thing we all go. And so tonight it's my pleasure to share this roundtable on the presidential election in the Philippines and the Catholic Church. I'm Michel Chambon, the coordinator of ISAC, the Initiative for the Study of Asian Catholics, and a research fellow at the Asia Research Institute here in Singapore. So as you know, a month ago, the Philippines elected a new president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., while the Catholic hierarchy had clearly supported Leni Robredo, the other candidate. So how is this result significant, or maybe not, to understand the role and the influence of the Catholic Church in the Philippines today? Or more broadly, what does it tell us about the Filipino nation and its relationship to the church and to the state? So to discuss this, we are with four distinguished speakers that let me introduce them by order of appearance. So first we will have JP Calleja, a lawyer and a journalist for UCANews. Then we have Dean Dolly with us, an assistant professor of political science at Singapore Management University. We have also Filomeno Aguilar, a professor of history at Ateneo de Manila University. And finally, we have Jael Cornelio, an associate professor in sociology at Ateneo de Manila University. So before we start this roundtable, let me just explain briefly the format. First, each speaker will have 10 minutes to share with us about the theme of their analysis of this election. Second, we will have a Q&A session of about 45 minutes, and we will end at 9:30. So this all being stated, let's start with a first speaker, JP Calleja, who will share with us about Filipino Catholic Hierarchy and the 2022 presidential elections. JP, the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all the participants of this roundtable all around the world. I am JP Calleja. I'm a lawyer and a journalist of UCANews. I'm also the spokesperson of the opposition coalition called Isang Bayan, headed by the retired Supreme Court Justice Antonio T. Carpio. If I may be allowed to share my screen, please. So the topic that I am supposed to discuss this evening is the Filipino Catholic Church hierarchy and the 2022 Philippine elections. As we heard a while ago, there was a clear support that Catholics, we all saw, no, from the Catholic hierarchy, from the bishops. And there were several manifestations of the support. For example, we have priests for Leni Robredo. We also have clergy for a moral choice. This is the first time since the EDSA People Power Revolution that the Catholic Church hierarchy, our clergymen in the Philippines, took a firm stance in support of a candidate or against a candidate. Perhaps many of our clergymen and our bishops today thought that the election was not just a matter of choosing the Philippines' next leader. It was a battle, it was a moral battle between good and evil. It was a battle between troll farms versus truth farms. It was a battle between the proliferation of truth and facts versus a whitewashing of Philippine history. In the words of former CBCP president and now Lingayen Dagupan Archbishop Socrates Villegas, the church cannot stand neutral in moral issues. The church cannot stand neutral. The church has a moral choice to exercise in favor of those who are oppressed, in favor of the truth. That was just a statement of Archbishop Soc Villegas, but the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, on the anniversary of the People Power Revolution on February 25 this year, circulated a pastoral statement called or entitled "The Truth Will Set You Free." So I will just quote certain parts of this pastoral letter. In this pastoral letter, they were not saying that they were against Bongbong Marcos explicitly, but you will see along the lines that they were against those who are presenting alternative facts, those who are saying that the martial law years were the golden years of Philippine history. So if I may quote the bishops in this presentation, they said, and I quote, "In this letter, we favor none but the truth. We wish to warn you of the radical distortions in the history of martial law and the EDSA People Power Revolution. In 1986, some of us, the bishops, were already members of the CBCP. We issued a post-election statement dated February 13, 1986, regarding the systematic disenfranchisement of voters, widespread and massive vote buying, deliberate tampering of election returns, intimidation, harassment, terrorism, and murder. In the same statement, we said, a government that assumes or retains power through fraudulent means has no moral basis. Thus, we ask you to see, to judge, and to act, clearly not with violence, but through peaceful means, and that was what happened." The bishops also said that there is no such thing as whitewashing of Philippine history with regard to martial law. Part of the campaign of the current president was to portray that there was no human rights violations in martial law. Part of their campaign was to promote that martial law years were the golden era in Philippine history. And many people believe that in social media. No? For example, I interviewed a taxi driver who really told me that he was voting for Bongbong Marcos because of Nutriban. Nutriban is that piece of bread packed with nutrients that was distributed during the Marcos era, because he said that it was a way to combat poverty and hunger during the time of martial law. But that was not true, because that particular project was funded by the United States of America. So there were historical distortions that happened along the way. And the bishops the bishops were very clear that the Filipino voter should stick to the facts. No? So if I may continue, the bishop said in the same pastoral letter, we did not invent the historic event that happened in EDSA. It was the fruit of love of neighbor and faith. With you, we were simply part of it. You and the world witnessed the peaceful revolution, which was rightly called people power. The peaceful revolution was not an invention of one person, one party, or one color. It was a triumph of the entire Filipino people. Many of us bishops were witnesses of the injustice and cruelty of martial law. So here, the bishops are already naming that particular event in Philippine history, which is martial law. And up until now, the human rights abuses, the victims, the corruption, the grave debt and economic downturn of the country due to dictatorship are all well documented. Again, we did not make this up. These are all written in our history. Now, why did the bishops write this? Because part of the campaign of the Marcos camp was to spread news that there were no cases rendered or decided by the Supreme Court that there were that they were guilty of graft and corruption cases. Of course, that's not true. Part of the campaign of the opposition is to have similar roundtable talks, stressing on actual cases decided by the Supreme Court, wherein the Supreme Court decided that there are graft and corrupt practices cases, and the Marcoses are guilty of these cases. But if you ask their supporters, they will say, well, these are just inventions of the opposition. These cases are not yet decided by the court. These cases are not yet proven, even if there are numerous cases already decided by the court. So these are the two main, I would say, members of the Catholic hierarchy who are very vocal, no? Who are very vocal in the fight against, not just a fight with the Marcoses, but it's a fight for truth and justice, especially the whitewashing or what we call historical distortion, no? Attempted by the camp of the Marcoses. They are Archbishop Socrates Villegas, who was the former secretary of the late Jaime Cardinal Sin, and the current CBCP president, Caloocan Bishop Pablo Virgilio David. Bishop Ambo is also a staunch critique of the Duterte administration because he's fighting, or he is against the extrajudicial killings that are happening now in the Philippines. His diocese in Caloocan, in Metro Manila, here in the Philippines, is a killing field, no, of vigilante groups. There are so many people, poor people, in fact, that were killed by vigilante groups. One of them is Kian de los Santos. He's holding that was the grave of Kian de los Santos. He's praying over it, and the court said that Kian de los Santos did not carry any firearm, did not carry any weapon, and he was killed by vigilante groups. He did not fight back. This is the common reason for by the vigilante groups or by the policemen. They call this nanlaban, or they fight back, no? But in truth and in fact, no one would fight back with the police. So these are the two main bishops, no, in the Catholic hierarchy who are very active in our fight for social justice. Now, what did they do exactly during or prior to the election? Well, Bishop Ambo is more careful, no? So he blessed a lay group endorsing Robredo and Pangilinan. This is a news clip from the CBCP, no? So he said, while cautious not to dictate on voters, Caloocan Bishop Pablo Virgilio David gave his blessing to a local lay group supporting presidential bet Leni Robredo and running mate Kiko Pangilinan in the May 9 polls. David is also the president of the CBCP, made this move as head of the Diocese of Caloocan, which covers 1.15 million Catholics in South Caloocan, Malabon, and Navota. So here, Bishop David formed a lay group called CLAP. No, so they are for principled politics. They are the ones who can participate directly in partisan politics. And he blessed them, saying, I gave my blessing, because the group arrived at supporting Leni Robredo and Kiko Pangilinan after a discernment process. So after a discernment process using Catholic guidelines, they arrive at their conclusion that Leni Robredo and Kiko Pangilinan deserve to be the president and the vice president. Now, but the question is, why did Marcos still win? No? Many people believe that the church should not meddle with politics. No, the church must take upon herself, or should not meddle, or must not engage in a political battle. In fact, other bishops, other clergymen in the Philippines rebuked the pastoral letter. Okay, because according to them, it's a violation of canon law, and the canon law states that clergymen must not engage in partisan politics, except when the common good requires it. So the bishops, at least voting or supporting Robredo, claimed that it's an exception to the general rule. The common law
Maybe
requires.
Can you wrap up? You have 1 minute left.
Okay. So the clergymen who supported Vice President Leni Robredo and Kiko Pangilinan are invoking the exception in canon law, which is the common good requires that priests must meddle in politics. Okay, but still, we know that Marcos still led over 15 million votes over Robredo. And thus, we have the following questions. How effective is the voice of the Philippine bishops today? Why is it that despite all of these groups, priests for Leni, clergy for a moral choice, Bishop David, Bishop Sok wearing pink masks, why is it that Leni Robredo still lost overwhelmingly against Marcos? Has the Catholic Church lost its voice in Philippine society? Do Filipinos want the Catholic Church hierarchy to remain in the pulpit? You just do your sacramentary thing, and leave politics alone to politicians. Don't meddle with us, no? Or is social media more powerful than the church's way of communication, like pastoral letters? Perhaps no one read the pastoral letter. I mean, no one even cared what the bishops wrote, because what is powerful nowadays is social media. It doesn't matter whether the content is true or not, as long as they see it in social media. Imelda Marcos once said that perception is real, truth is not. And the last question is, how influential is the church today in the life of the common Filipino? So the answers to these questions are not easy. So even the bishops themselves are contemplating, they are reflecting on the answers to these questions. So I end my presentation with that. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening to my short presentation. Good evening.
Thanks to you, GP. It was a pleasure. So I think you can stop sharing your screen. And now we will give the floor to Professor Dean Duley. We will talk about historical memory, martial law, and the Marcos presidency.
All right. Thank you, Michelle. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming. It's good to be here. I'm going to talk about the 2022 Philippine presidential elections. And, I think in this panel, what I can contribute is to try to give a data-driven approach and to think a little bit about why Marcos actually won, right? You don't know the answer really. And at the end of my presentation, we still won't know the answer. But let's have some data to sort of structure the way we think about what just happened, right? So here's my thesis, actually. The election is history, ideas, history, and memory, not demography. All right. We know that Bongbong Marcos won. Let's take it as a given. He not only won, but he won convincingly. He had more than double the number of votes as his second closest competitor, Leni Robredo. This is surprising to many people, but he won the majority. If we take that as given, the real question is to understand why he won and to try to make sense of it and to try to respond to that win. But I think if you were to ask people why Bongbong Marcos actually won, I think the honest answer is it's not yet clear. There are many theories as to why he won. They're not mutually exclusive. So let me list like the many ideas that people talked about or I've heard that allowed Bongbong to win. Number one, let's say it's about young voters' age. Young voters don't remember martial law, right? They don't remember how bad it was. And they're more likely to vote for Bongbong Marcos. There is another way, another theory, misinformation. So this is the TikTok social media story, right? The reimagining of martial law as the golden age of the Philippine economy. And so wanting to return to this supposed golden age that JP was talking about earlier. There's also this idea of education. So the Filipino voters are poorly educated, right? At least the low awareness about why martial law was so bad. And all of these things imply continuity, right? Some sense of like past and present, that Ferdinand Marcos Sr., the former president, affects people's perceptions and willingness to vote for Bongbong Marcos, right? Ferdinand Marcos Jr. There are also theories about sort of more structural theories that Marcos's win was really an indictment of this post-Marcos Sr., post-people power liberal order, of which Duterte was the first iteration. So Marcos is not Marcos per se, but a continuation of a repudiation of what had happened post-1986. And sort of the more simple story is how much of it is just ethnic and regional voting. How much of this is Marcos the natural continuation of Duterte-era policies, and that was facilitated by his joint running with Sara Duterte, right, Rodrigo Duterte's daughter, as the vice president of Bongbong Marcos. Of course, it's important to know why this is the case. We don't agree with this. So what is the scope and content of policies that we can actually take to respond to this? And I think that trying to understand what really went on gives us a deeper understanding of how Philippine politics in general works and how Filipino voters actually make electoral decisions. So this is not just speculation, right? Like these are news, like major international outlets talking about these different ideas. Vox talked about illiberalism in the Philippines. The Japan Times talked about young people hoping to upend an election. And the New York Times focused on this ecosystem for misinformation and false fake news, right? So they're not mutually exclusive, I want to say, but there are these different ideas, and how much do each of them contribute to actually what happened, right? And so I'll try to think about that a little bit. And the theme that I want to get at here is this is an election about ideas, not demographics. And I'm going to talk more about that later on. So what I'm going to do is to use survey data. So several rounds of nationally representative survey data from Pulse Asia to try to figure out this question. What explains who votes for Bongbong Marcos and who does not? So number one major result, I'll talk about three things that matter and three things that matter less. Thing that matters, number one, continuity with Duterte. There's a strong correlation between supporting President Duterte and supporting Bongbong Marcos. If you can see, people who truly approve of Duterte are almost 80% as likely to vote for Bongbong Marcos, while those who disapprove, truly disapprove of Duterte are not even 20% as likely to vote for Bongbong Marcos. It's a huge difference. And it's almost like this monotonic increase, right? The more you like Duterte, the more likely you are to vote for Bongbong Marcos. And the magnitude between truly disapprove to truly approve is like 5 times, right? So it's a huge 5-6 times. So it's a huge difference. How you see Duterte is highly correlated with how likely you are to vote for Bongbong Marcos. So the Duterte factor clearly matters somewhat. Number two, historical memory matters. So what do you think about martial law? What do you think about Ferdinand Marcos Sr., Bongbong Marcos' father? If you look at the panel on the left, people who thought positively or strongly positively about Ferdinand Marcos, right, the former president, are at least 70% as likely to vote for his son, Bongbong. But those who think negatively are just about 30% as likely, and those who think strongly negatively are just about 10% as likely. So you're going from just above 10% likely to vote for Bongbong if you really, really didn't like his father, to more than 80% as likely, 80% likely to vote for Bongbong if you really like his father. So historical continuity, right? Marcos Sr. matters for Marcos Jr. in terms of who's going to vote for him. And martial law matters as well. Almost 90% of people who strongly approved of martial law also wanted to vote for Bongbong Marcos. But here's the funny thing, literally no one who strongly opposed martial law, the martial law era, wanted to vote for Bongbong. None. And that's a strong result because, as we know, a lot of people voted for Bongbong. To have no one answer that they would vote for Bongbong if they really didn't like martial law is a big deal, right? So what do we know now? So continuity with Duterte matters and historical memory matters as well. And the third thing is like, it's not as exciting as the other two, but regional differences still matter. And this is where you see, I think, the combination of like North and South, Sara Duterte and Bongbong Marcos really matter a lot. I actually kind of screwed this up and there's no y-axis, but if you're Ilocano or identify as Ilocano, you're over 80% as likely to vote for Bongbong Marcos. Of course, that's sort of the Marcos region. But that goes as low as around 10 to 15% if you identify as Bicolano because you would rather support Leni Robredo. So the variation here is not quite as stark, but it's still obvious, right? So when we talk about things like misinformation, things about Duterte, I think one part of the story that we shouldn't forget is that regional politics, regional voting, ethnic voting, if you take a more sort of general policy literature, still matters in whether voters vote for Marcos or not. Okay, so what matters? Duterte matters, historical memory with Marcos' father matters, and region matters. But what matters less? So education. I wouldn't say education matters less, but I would say educational differences do not explain a wide variation or do not explain very greatly voting for Bongbong Marcos or not. There's no clear pattern in terms of whether someone was a college graduate or only an elementary school graduate in whether they're likely to vote for Bongbong or not. In fact, the surprising result is that people with the lowest level of education are the least likely to vote for Bongbong Marcos. Maybe it's not surprising for some of you, but it was a little bit surprising for me. But not only that, it's non-monotonic, meaning you don't see any clear pattern correlation between higher education and likelihood to vote for Bongbong Marcos. In fact, vocational is the most likely to vote for Bongbong Marcos. But even if you look at that, look at high school to college graduates, this is a difference between 55 to 60%. That's not huge. Marcos won by more than double. that number. And those differences in a smaller survey may not be statistically significant. So educational differences don't seem to explain who votes for Marcos or not. Likewise with age. So age, there is some of it, right? So the least likely to vote for Bongbong Marcos are people who are 65 and over. They were young adults during people power. And that's over 40%. But a majority of all the other cohorts, meaning 18 to 64 years old, a majority are likely to vote for Bongbong Marcos. So this is suggestive somewhat, right, of some degree of misinformation and what have you. But still, majority in almost all age groups chose to vote for Bongbong. So this is not so much a story, I think, given this result, between experiencing and remembering or knowing historically through books and such things. The last thing that matters is class difference. Richer people, poorer people, are they more likely to vote for Bongbong or not? We don't know. In fact, you can hardly tell at all. There's almost no differences across income classes. So what doesn't seem to matter or explain as much, education, age, and income. So these are demographics. So they seem to matter a lot less. So ideas seem to matter more. Your perception of who you are and who you want matters more than what you are, how you're measured, right? I would say this though. This is my take. Maybe it's controversial, but I think the misinformation theory is very plausibly true, but also somewhat overstated as an explainer of what actually happened. So the survey asked what you think about martial law. Do you think positively or negatively? Actually, the modal answer is you can't say if it's positive or negative. Positive much more likely than negative. But if you look at the people who thought positively about martial law, that's like 30. You're getting around 35 to 37%. Right? So I think if the misinformation story was the #1 driver of what was going on, you'd see that possibly be a lot higher because a lot of people were misinformed. And so they liked martial law, right? But that's not really the case. So I think the misinformation story is one of those things that I clearly think happened. But it's not, I think, sufficient to explain what's actually going on. Oops. So let me just, here are the major takeaways, right? What matters? Continuity Duterte, perceptions of martial law, and regional differences. Those are high variation variables. What matters less? Education, age, and income. And that sort of brings you to misinformation, continuity with Duterte era policies, regional and ethnic differences, and sort of like pushback against the the post-Marcos liberal regime as sort of theories that still tend to hold water given what the data suggests. And I want to end really quickly on the Catholic Church, and because this is a Catholic Church forum, and to think about the role of the church in all this. So these are more my questions, and this I kind of open up for people to think about. But the Catholic Church was a major player in the post-Marcos, the removal of Marcos Sr. And if you believe the story of the repudiation or the delegitimization of the post-Marcos liberal order, to what extent has perceptions of the church also been affected by that? Number two, the church has taken stands, right, against the very popular Duterte administration. And in fact, there's very, very good evidence that areas with a parish church suffered fewer drug war deaths. And the argument of the authors who wrote that is that the church has both an organizational capacity and normative commitment to human rights. So what will the church's stand be over a candidate that seems to be a continuation or will continue a significant amount of Duterte era sentiment? Education doesn't seem to matter. Finally, education doesn't seem to matter. Years of education does not predict, right, whether people vote for Marcos Sr. or not. So to what extent can the church fill in as a provider of education and giving people sort of like what actually happened during the martial law period, and how much will it matter? So I'm going to leave that to everyone, and thanks for listening.
Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. So we will have time to discuss this during the Q&A session, so do not hesitate to share your questions through the chat box for now. So let's move to our next speaker. So Professor Filomeno Aguilar, we will talk about the vote of the poor. Professor Aguilar, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, and good evening to everyone. As we've heard, the support for Marcos really cuts across all social classes, A, B, C, D, and E. The proportions are relatively about the same. But nonetheless, I would argue that the reasons for why the rich support the Marcos Duterte tandem would be, I'm just turning on my video. The reason why A, B, and C would support Marcos Duterte would be different from the reasons why class D and E would support Marcos Duterte. Now, this is really based on two sets of studies that were conducted long before there was social media. Sometime in 2004, we conducted the 16 focus group discussions nationwide at the Institute of Philippine Culture at Ateneo de Manila University. And then again, in 2016, we conducted 4 focus group discussions involving poor residents in 3 urban areas. One was disaster. One had suffered a disaster in Tacloban, and a 4th one in a rural area. Now, I have no time to go through all of the details of these 2 studies, but let me just state very briefly that the poor have a perspective on elections that the non-poor take for granted. The poor have a perspective on elections that the non-poor take for granted. Now, one such insight, for instance, is that the poor realize that elections represent an unusual period when the normal rules of society are suspended. They speak about it in terms of metaphors such, this is like a fiesta, it is like sinulog, it is a time when money flows, it's a time of excess where there's a lot of noise and a lot of papers being posted all over the place. So it is a time out of joint, and people realize that. If as an anthropologist you think in terms of a ritual structure, this is the liminal period followed finally by the resolution after election day. The second point is that the poor participate in elections because they believe casting one's vote is an obligation. It is actually not an obligation by law, but many of the poor participants in these 2 studies have come to believe that it is their duty, that they must participate and vote. In fact, interestingly, somebody actually, somewhere in Iloilo, a respondent said, if we do not vote, we are like people of the forest. So for the poor, to participate in an election was a sign of both civilization and of sociality, of being part of formal society. In other words, they value elections. And then when it comes to the choice of candidates, the poor follow their own rationality in choosing the candidates they prefer. That may seem obvious, but people always ridicule the poor as dumb. As everyone knows, there is the phrase called bobotante, bobo for dumb, for bobo botante. But the studies that we have conducted, in fact, show that the poor vote is a thinking vote. But here, what is interesting is that they try to assess the candidate. They look at them. They have their own criteria for assessing a candidate. The way a person talks, when they watch them in some video or graphics, they watch how they behave. They have their own criteria for determining approachability of a candidate or the person's charisma, which in layman's parlance would be kung may dating. And then a 4th insight is that the poor who do engage in vote buying and vote selling follow a moral calculus for their action. People in the middle class and the upper class usually think that the poor are simply blinded by money. And so they'd accept the money. And so, which is why they had to be instructed, get the money and vote according to your conscience. But people have their own, as I put here, the poor mind the ethics of their vote. Some people say that this money that I receive to buy my vote is dead money, quote unquote. In Bicol, it was said as gadan na kwarta. It's dead money, so I will not use this money to feed my children. I will use this so that my drinking buddies and I can have a good time. Or as happened maybe according to the news, they simply bought cell phones. It's because the money itself is seen as contaminated, and if they use it to buy food, it would morally pollute their children. And so people have their own moral calculus. If they accept it, they say, oh, it's because this is my money coming back to me. These are the money I paid in taxes, to valid tax. I should not compromise. I will not accept this money because I think I want to preserve my own independence. So people have those ideas. Now, in our study in 2016, we found that the urban poor generally see the giving of money during elections as vote buying, whereas the rural poor may say it's vote buying, but it is also helping the poor. So there is some ambiguity here. It is not necessarily simply buying votes, but because people are very poor, they would be given money and they'd receive it. And in this poor community that we studied, in fact, they do not give the money until the brokers at the village level are assured that you would actually vote for that candidate. So there is a certain mechanism that is at play at different local levels. The disaster poor and the rural poor also tend not to say that when they accept money, they are necessarily selling one's vote. So the whole issue of vote buying and vote selling needs to be nuanced. So as we said, the poor have a perspective on elections that the non-poor take for granted. And here, let me shift quickly to, there are no studies yet, formal studies, especially village level studies on the 2022 elections, but just we can say if there are two sides of victimhood. The non-poor and pro-Leni, predominantly middle class, see the country as the victim of Marcos's martial law. And there is that trauma. And we saw this very clearly in what JP showed about the stance of the bishops. The poor who are pro-Marcos think that it is actually Marcos who was the victim of people power, and therefore they too are victims and they can personally empathize with Marcos Sr. as a victim. Notice something here. The non-poor pro-Leni think of the victim in an abstract sense of the country or the Philippines, whereas the poor think in terms of a very specific person, not an abstract ideal. Marcos as victim, I am a victim, I empathize with Marcos. And two approaches to poverty. The non-poor pro-Leni camp would say good governance will improve the lives of all people, including the poor. Gobyernong tapat, sa gobyernong tapat, aangat lahat. Whereas the poor pro-Marcos people will say, very specifically, BBM promised that the price of rice will be cut by half. Right now, milled rice, depending on how it's milled, is being sold at 38 to 41 pesos. And then Marcos promised he will cut it by half, roughly, and rice will be sold at 20 pesos per kilo. Of course, that is a very difficult promise to fulfill, and Marcos Jr. himself said, oh, that's aspirational, quote unquote. But the idea here is that for the poor, this is something very concrete, and they can look forward, or they actually do look forward to the price of rice going down to 20 pesos a kilo. Whereas the non-poor think that the general idea of a trickle-down effect because of good governance will finally help them. It will be convincing to the middle class, but not concrete enough and plausible enough for the poor. Now, in my short presentation, I'd just like to emphasize that the data that we gathered from 2004 and 2016, I had the opportunity to present to the bishops in February 2021, over a year before the election. There was a lot of bishops, but not the big stars, but a lot of bishops online and some church workers. And in the end, during the open forum, it was emphasized, I emphasized, that there is a need to understand the poor and to dialogue with them, to try to gain their perspective. I was surprised that despite being pro-poor, many of the bishops found dialogue on election matters unthinkable. Some were really upset. They think that their usual role of speaking in the pulpit, of lecturing to the people, should be the same mode when it comes to elections. And so there were even some segments that were thinking, but there is a Catholic vote. So I had to say that they were totally in fantasy land. There is no Catholic vote. So evidently, the church hierarchy were not prepared to dialogue with the poor long before the election. And in fact, as we have already seen, this came out in the news. I just like to read, this is from Rappler, and it says, the bishops or the clergy remind Filipinos of their sacred duty to vote. If you were middle class, you'd say, oh yes, a lot of people don't, the poor don't think that their vote is sacred. If I were poor and I would hear this of their sacred duty to vote, I were poor, I would say, but of course, I know it's an obligation. I'm taking it seriously. Why are you trying to condescend me? And to vote only for the right leaders of this beloved country. Of course, if you were middle class, you'd think, of course, my choice is right. In other words, here, there is always the subtext. There is the poor who do not know how to vote for the right leaders. And so if I were poor, I'd say, of course, I will vote for the right leaders, the people I think who are right for the country. So essentially, the point is that a clergy that does not listen undermines itself. And that's where I end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And we will continue to discuss this during the Q&A. But before we move to that final stage, let us listen to Professor Jael Cornelio, who will present on Christianity and authoritarian nostalgia. Jael, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle. Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be here, sharing insights about our respective perspectives on what just happened in the past month. So you see on your screen my presentation. When the Marcoses fled Malacanang in 1986, recalls Riza Robles, the journalist, many Filipinos heaved a sigh of relief, thinking that they were gone for good. She then asks how it was possible for the Marcoses, less than 3 decades after people power, to be parked at the very doorstep of Malacanang. Her answer, because they never really left. Today, the family is back in power, with Marcos's children occupying prominent positions in local and national politics. What might account for their enduring popularity? Scholars believe that it is indicative of authoritarian nostalgia, the broad appeal of strongman rule among the public. While this is clearly evident in the popularity of Duterte and his war on drugs, much of it is tied to the mythical good old days of strong leadership under President Marcos. In what follows, I turn to authoritarian nostalgia as the tacit but lingering disposition among many Filipinos for strongman rule. The authoritarian past may have only recently emerged as a widespread object of mass nostalgia, but according to Bobby Benedicto, the Filipino people have long been anticipating Marcos's return. As I will discuss in this presentation, recent scholarship points to its pervasiveness and underpinning values. But more importantly, my friends, I discuss authoritarian nostalgia as the social context in which Christian communities are now embedded, I know that my colleagues have raised very important questions about the role of Christianity now, Catholicism in particular. But as you will see in my presentation, I'm also casting my net wide, covering also other Christian denominations. Drawing on the Asian Barometer survey from 2002 to 2016, a period that predated Duterte's presidency, Pernia shows that Filipinos have long embraced authoritarian values. These values are measured in terms of a person's willingness to submit to government decisions, 1. 2, resistance towards having too many different views in society. And 3, support for a strong leader. Apparently, Filipinos have consistently agreed with these statements throughout the 4 waves of the survey. But Pernia's analysis provides a rather counterintuitive finding. It turns out that these scores are positively, and this is interesting, it turns out that these scores are positively correlated with public trust in political institutions, the courts, national government, local government, and Congress. Thus, the authoritarian values to which Filipinos might subscribe are not necessarily anti-democratic. At the very least, they show that the concern for stability and harmony, unity, we heard that a lot in the past months, underpins support for strong leaders who can carry out programs without the need for congressional checks or even electoral constraints. Some of the keywords that we hear are related to this: political power or political will, for example. This may be an indication of the ambivalent disposition many Filipinos have towards democracy, a point that other scholars similarly make. Without denying the significance of freedom and democracy, many Filipinos, for example, seem to be convinced that it needs to be restrained. Too much democracy. Based on interviews with middle-class Filipinos, and this is a counterpoint to Professor Aguilar's presentation, Webb has observed the recurring insinuation among her interlocutors that freedom in the Philippines is excessive. Webb is a fellow sociologist, political sociologist. This is why they believe that one can only earn it after having fulfilled the responsibility as a citizen, say by paying taxes. Democracy is good, according to her informants, but, quote, there is an element of compliance implied in the notion of democracy as freedom. The onus of compliance is on the individual citizen to stay within certain boundaries of moral behavior, unquote. Her interlocutors also believe that the only way excessive freedom can be restrained is, no surprises here, by having a strong leader. The exercise of political authority, according to Webb, even if that authority oversteps the boundaries of individual freedoms and liberties, is deemed necessary and certainly acceptable. Based on these studies, my friends, ladies and gentlemen, social order, compliance, and discipline are virtues that underpin authoritarian nostalgia. Social order, compliance, discipline. There are a few key insights here. For one, to long for strongman rule, as I have noted above, is not to give up on democracy per se. Institutions are still important, and Filipinos would like them to be reliable. Everybody has to conduct transactions with the government after all. We want the institutions to be reliable. But at the same time, social order seems to be among the chief values underlying authoritarian nostalgia. Filipinos sold to this idea are bothered by criminal disruptions in their communities. I'll get to that in a bit, the war on drugs, for example. If this assessment is correct, then inherent to people's sense of right and wrong is social order. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm highlighting this because I am primarily a sociologist of religion, and I'm very much interested in how morality plays out in the field of politics and people's political choices. Webb's interlocutors above, in what I have just discussed, might come from the middle class, but many in rural poor communities may in fact also echo their points. Here we go. The support for the war on drugs, for example, comes from many aspirational breadwinners who are convinced that criminal behavior endangers not just their safety, but their very attempt to lead decent lives to improve their fortunes. In this light, the decisive leadership that President Duterte promised during his campaign in 2016 tapped into people's anxieties and hopes at the same time, and turned local concerns for safety into national policy. Thus, even if it entailed violent action on the part of the state, the war on drugs was widely supported. It gave them a sense of social order in their communities. Now, Religious viewpoints matter here as well. On your screen are some of my recent writings on this. War on Drugs, co-written with some of my colleagues. While many religious entities, especially within the Catholic Church, obviously clearly resisted the war on drugs and the proposed reinstatement of the death penalty, many others threw their support behind them. Much of this religious worldview, present in Catholic and other Christian circles, takes the battle for social order as ultimately a war between good and evil. Thus, in this worldview, God needs to appoint a leader who can instill order, compliance, and discipline. There is therefore a religious, or, if you will, theological dimension to authoritarian nostalgia. Note, to pay attention to the demand side of strongman rule is not to lay the blame on the population at large. I'm not doing that. We're not in that business. Wider social and political processes have rendered authoritarian leadership a seductive option for the public. Some scholars, for example, find that the problem lies in the inadequate coverage of martial law in basic education. I know that Professor Dulay has nuanced this a little bit. But I would also say that to this could be added the role of industries behind this information. Not only are they erasing history, as some of our journalists and colleagues are very concerned about, which ultimately engenders historical amnesia. Authoritarian nostalgia in this light is a constructed fantasy. Finally, other scholars refer to the very character of democracy in the Philippines, one that perennially banks on revolutionary saviors, unfortunately in the form of elite rule. Now, I am saying all of this as a brief preface, if you will, to my real point in this presentation, namely that the seduction of authoritarian nostalgia is the social condition in which Philippine Christian churches find themselves today. Given the history of Christianity in the time of martial law, one cannot deny the role religious institutions can continue to play, in spite of their unpopularity, as important channels of political dissent. Why do I say this? For example, 93% of Filipinos say that they trust the church. That's what the 2021 Philippine Trust Index says. In fact, it's the #1 institution across all many other institutions. At the same time, religious work permeates many aspects of society and social life that are inseparable from the realm of politics. From community organizing to disaster response, faith-based communities tend to intervene where the state fails to provide the assistance needed. This, of course, is not new. Even at the time of martial law, the church fulfilled, before it became a national player, it was a community-based player. That's what I'm saying. That in a context of authoritarian nostalgia, maybe the work of the church should not be at the national stage, but at the level of communities. To highlight these points, however, is not to romanticize the role of religion in democratic processes. We also know that at certain points in the time of Marcos, the Catholic Church was also complicit. We can talk about that later on. Now, I also wanted to highlight in the last parts of my presentation, last 2 or 3 minutes that I have left, I want to highlight as well what the other Christian communities have also been doing. In a statement on the 49th anniversary of the declaration of martial law, the National Council of Churches in the Philippines reminded its congregations of the suffering their own people had to endure. You see this on your screen. According to NCCP, thousands were arrested, tortured, and even killed. Among them were Bishop Laverne Mercado, the General Secretary, who was arrested, and Deaconess Filomena Asuncion of the United Methodist Church, who was captured and abused before being killed. Martial law was indeed one of the darkest days in our history. Again, even non-Catholic churches are doing a lot of this. Church groups like the Catholic Biblical Association of the Philippines, and presumably also progressive, have even taken the Marcoses to task. Last year as well, they said the following: the Marcoses have not owned their sins despite the evidence of stealing and violation of human rights. Instead, they are making efforts to change history. All of us are accountable for the history of oppression under the Marcos dictatorship. To rectify is the responsibility of all of us. Inasmuch as historical reminders are important, they may not necessarily be sufficient in putting a check on authoritarian nostalgia. This is important, and maybe this is the answer to the questions that have been raised just now. Why is no one listening to the church leaders? This is because the narratives of authoritarian nostalgia are built on fantasies about the glorious past and the fallen state of the present. For its propagandists, that the present is in a fallen state can only mean that it needs redemption through a messianic figure. While this may be found in the person of Duterte or the dictator's son, it does not have to be them. It could be someone else who can accomplish national greatness, make the Philippines great again, through the nostalgic virtues of social order, compliance, and discipline. At the same time, I have to say this, there is in authoritarian nostalgia a strong religious overtone. For people who subscribe to it, social divisions exist between the moral we and the evil other. This is articulated in so many ways: the decent citizen versus the criminal other, the sinner and the saint. How then shall we move on? Maybe there are a couple of answers here, and I've already pointed this out. Right now, we know that many churches are also emerging who are in fact very supportive of the Marcos Duterte regime. These are Kiboloy's Church in Davao and the Iglesia ni Cristo. In other words, the religious picture is very messy, and it doesn't necessarily mean that if you are religious, then you are already progressive. Maybe this is something that we can talk about in the open forum. I certainly think that the church, Christian communities have a big role to play in terms of public theology. Public theology essentially is about making theological ideas understandable, acceptable to the public, but in ways that could also relate to the concerns and the needs of people. I think Professor Aguilar has rightly pointed out that many of the ideas that came from the non-poor were very abstract, and public theology's point is really to make that articulate in ways that could be understood by the people. To end, last 30 seconds, Ferdinand Marcos's vision of the new society collapsed because it ultimately betrayed his own people. What empowered the faith community at that time was their own vision of development, grounded in social justice, people's participation, and the promise of progress for all. The frustration lingers and animates the fantasy of the past. My two questions: what vision does Christian discourse have to offer as an alternative? And can it be more compelling once again? Thank you so much.
Thanks to you for this fascinating presentation, and to all of you for keeping up your presentation within the framework of 10 minutes or so. That was very good. So we have about 30 minutes left to share questions and to discuss what have been presented so far. So I see questions coming up. So without further ado, we can maybe invite Ansley Juliana to present a question that she wrote in the chat box earlier. So could you please unmute yourself?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Again, good evening to our speakers. I posted this since it was kind of a burning question, but I might as well read it. One thing that is probably not entirely spoken of openly, both by the Philippine Catholic Church, clergy, and lay people, is the ideological divide that has persisted within the Philippine Catholic Church, even during the martial years and post-EDSA years. I'm speaking here as a researcher myself, but when I interviewed Catholic NGOs who are engaged in national politics, they gave me the impression that even the Philippine laity and even priests, parish priests, even bishops, have been cherry picking, if not actively ignoring, the mandate of social teaching that they're supposedly motivating them to engage more progressively in politics. Now, this might actually have been also compounded by the alienation of progressive forces, civil society, social movements from the Catholic Church due to their stances on sexual and gender politics. It has been noted by social movements I interview that they almost always they find it frustrating that they ally with the church when it comes to land rights and labor, sectoral rights, but they're always enemies when it comes to the liberation of women and gender issues, LGBT rights for that matter. And even with Pope Francis and the push for greater social action, middle class and gentrified stereotype of Philippine Catholicism has persisted to an extent that even with younger or more sizable progressives within the Catholic constituency, this is no longer enough. So I'd just like to invite the panel, if you want, how do you read the situation, since this is my reading, and I'm getting the impression that there seems to be overlaps with our presenters. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'll let the speakers decide who would like to engage with this question.
Sorry, Michelle, may I volunteer myself? I was waiting for Professor Aguilar to step in, but no, I think Hansley, you're spot on there. I think much of what we are seeing with the Catholic Church right now, and perhaps arguably the reality that nobody is really listening to the church leaders is concerned, I think really began with the RH bill debates. I think that really brought to the surface the fact that now you have a big proportion of the population, and certainly the majority obviously are Catholic, who are not convinced that the church has the final say on everything. And in fact, and also even in my own research, I also wanted to say that even in from the 2000s onwards, various surveys also have pointed out that Filipino Catholics are less and less interested in the political position of the church. Specifically, they would say that whenever they go to church, they don't want they don't want their priest to talk about politics. So I say all of that as the context, the dispositional context among the population that the church has already lost its political influence insofar as these controversial issues are concerned. And I think this is a tangential answer to your question. I suppose that cherry picking, I think, is also the symptom of or also how the church is reacting here. They feel that they want to respond to. I think they would like to respond to as many issues as possible, and you can just go on the website of CBCP, for example, and see that they have made statements about anything and everything. But nobody really listens to all of these or reads them unless they are very controversial. And then when they are controversial, the population pushes back, namely RH Bill, and then in this case, Leni Robredo. So in that sense, I think that the endorsement, in fact, backfired more than it really helped Leni Robredo. Yeah. Thanks, Hansley.
Thank you. So, Professor Aguilar, would you like to add something?
I am not sure how to answer Hansley's question because I do not have data, empirical information about what's going on inside the Catholic Church and the divides within the clergy. And if there are divisions, they are able to conceal these divisions very well. And so I think, Hansley, you were trying to ask about these kinds of ideological divide, right? But, and so I don't know, but my suspicion is that generally, like during the period of martial law, it was valid to actually go out of one's way to oppose the regime and even to be partners with the underground armed movement, the revolution, as long as there were certain boundaries that were respected within the hierarchy. But this time, I don't think, this is just an impression, I don't think that that is the case. And if you have had figures that were veering to the left, more or less, they have really been brought to the center. But this is just an impression. Without data, without really interviewing priests, it is hard to say. But one thing is noticeable in terms of the Social Action Center. I recall under martial law, social action, and I think Mary Bracelis would know this too, the social action in the Archdiocese of Manila was always the hotbed. It was always very left, very anti-Marcos. You talk to social action people now, it's very centrist. You can see that there has really the demise of the dictatorship led the church, even the social action sectors within the church, to move towards the center, I think. Again, impressionistic, no data.
Thank you. Professor Dulé, would you like to add something or it's fine?
No, I think it's fine. I think the other two speakers
Yeah.
are more
Great.
yeah, suited to
So we
answer.
just move to the next question. So I saw Sister Vicky Victorino, you shared a comment. Would you like to bring it to all of us? Could you unmute yourself?
Okay. As I said, there's an insight which came to me while listening to the four speakers, and I found it a bit interesting when I was hearing that the Catholic Church in the Philippines is not identified with the poor. Maybe so that is a perception that being a church person, I thought now we have to correct our perception of ourselves, because in action, when there are things to be done for the poor, I know that it's the Catholic Church rushing, trying to be there, to be present. But what happened during the election seems to be different. And I agree with some of the speakers who said that Leni was perceived more as not for the poor. Because I'm living in Hong Kong, but I heard some people here in Hong Kong saying that they will not vote for Leni because she's not pro-poor. Now, the follow-up question there, which I find also very interesting, is how can the poor identify Marcos as one of them? I mean, with all the history, the baggage of history there, with the billions that we're still trying to recover, how is this perception of Marcos being pro-poor, how did this pass on? Maybe you can comment.
Yes, I think I can say that the poor do not see Ferdinand Marcos Jr. as poor, but they see him as their datu. They see him as their traditional leader. And the leader, the datu, and his dependents in the old pre-colonial barangay would always have this kind of bond, paternalism, benevolence towards all the dependents. So in a sense, we are still in that pre-colonial cultural framework when we think about leaders and followers. So definitely the datu is not poor. The datu is different from us, and yet our own lives are intertwined with the datu. So it is possible, if you think of reality in those terms, it is possible to understand why people can identify and empathize with Marcos Jr. Now, the church, going back to your question, the church identifies itself as the church for the poor. Very clearly, it makes that pronouncement. I don't know if it does it consistently and in different media how it does it. But to say that we are pro-poor and to act towards the poor are two separate things. One can always feel very paternalistic, like the datu, or you can always be quite authoritarian, as Dr. Cornelio told us, and the church goes in and dictate because we know what is morally right, and you don't, which is why the bishops, many bishops, not all, but many bishops did not want to listen to the poor in how they look at elections, because on this matter, we, the hierarchy, knows more than you. So there is an assumption that, yes, I am pro-poor, which is why I'm trying to educate you from a position of superiority rather than from the position of a co-equal. Can you imagine? It would be truly revolutionary if an ordinary bishop sits down with a peasant as a co-equal, conversing and trying to share their ideas. That would be truly revolutionary, and that would be truly pro-poor. But many of our bishops, sadly, cannot imagine themselves in that kind of position, dialoguing, talking, chatting, joking with the poor. because it is always from the perspective of the pulpit that they must speak. It is always the pulpit that is above and everyone else is below, listening, following, thinking that every word one says will immediately be accepted, believed, and followed. Maybe in the 19th century, that would have happened, but even then, it did not really happen that way. So I don't know if that answers your questions, Sister Vicky.
Thank you. So I saw questions and comments from Mary Reselis. So if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Jael and I have discussed this before, and I don't want to keep banging at him on, but you know, Sister really brought out for me how you do have to disaggregate, even in the church, because you're absolutely right in my view about that priests and bishops, with a few exceptions, are not with the people, are not seen as being with or comfortable with. If you go to poor communities, the church there is the nuns. It's the sisters who are doing a lot of the work. Now, because I think there are fewer of them these days, maybe that's less important. But for many people, the church is really the nuns there. Sometimes they run schools, but they also are very community oriented, right? And they're comfortable with the poor for the most part. So I do want to say to Sister that she shouldn't despair, because I think it's a very part of that is a gender issue. This is a very all male, exclusively male hierarchy and priests and the whole structure, which in a way defines, a certain style, which of course, Professor Aguilar has already said, a very top-down kind of authoritarian thing. But the nuns are much less so. So, and since they are part of part of the structure of the church, I think we should recognize that gender difference. At least it's worth investigating. But I also wanted to ask, I think there is really no women's vote as far as I can figure out in the Philippines, right? And yet I wonder, when you say, was Jael or was it June who said, Filipinos like order, they like this and this. I think maybe men for sure. I'm not so sure that women do, because for them, authoritarian, strong man, for them means they get beaten up and they have little to say, right? So if you have women who are aware that they're victimized by male authoritarian tendencies of strong men, I'm not so sure that that value set is entrenched in them also. So I mean, that's just a hypothesis. I think it's worth investigating, how do, especially poor women, I mean, I don't know about the others, but for urban poor women, I do think there is a difference in the way they manage community affairs, which is their domain, right? The community is their domain because the men are supposed to be looking for work. And they're not putting down the men are supposed to do that. They bring them in if they need them. But they really run the community and think up new ideas, especially when they get organized, by an NGO, by a left group or whatever. So I do think this gender issue in leadership and followership in elections really needs to be explored better. Do women just in relation to just, so no fighting in the household, just go along with whatever the husband says or not. So just especially for the mass population, I think we need to know more about the gender differences in values and attitudes. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mary. Actually, parenting studies show that men, the husband, the father is expected to be the authoritarian enforcer in the family, and wives are also complaining when the men do not perform that role. They want their husbands to be the disciplinarian. Yeah. But this is just from parenting studies. The other thing, maybe Jael should respond to Mary, but I was just going to say to Sister Vicky that in the last election, actually, in some parishes, at least in a few parishes, there was an attempt to listen to the poor and to dialogue with the poor. But these, of course, were not the clergy, not even the nuns. These were youth. young people volunteers, both men, young men and young women, going out there to dialogue with the poor, to listen, to understand their views. Although, of course, it came too late. Even within the campaign period, it came too late. But at least there has been a start, and it's a very small start of trying to listen to the poor.
Can I add to that a little bit? Just because the gender question, is there a women's vote and all of that, just because I was actually looking at the surveys and looking at sort of the gender difference in the surveys, both for Marcos and for Duterte. So actually, so this doesn't answer questions about Catholic hierarchy and organization, and not necessarily for the reasons why men and women may differ. But actually, there is no difference between men and women over whether they're likely to vote for Marcos or not. There is a difference. Men are more likely to vote for Duterte. That's over or more likely to support Duterte, but it's really only a 2 percentage point difference. So it's not actually a big difference. And so I didn't include it in the presentation, but the gender differences don't seem to be very large. But also speaking to what people value, right? And so I didn't do any disaggregation between main policy priorities or the most important thing and gender, but overwhelmingly it's going to be peace and order, law, right, safety. They're like overwhelming, and these are like different actual items on the survey, and they tend to be overwhelmingly the top ones that are always selected. So what we do know, at least from the surveys, is that support for Duterte, there's tiny differences. And support for Marcos, there are basically no differences. But in terms of the non-gender breakdown of what matters, I think it really supports what everyone's been saying. It's sort of this idea of law and order, peace, and all of that really, really matters to the vast majority of voters.
Thank you. Well, to add on that note, I have to confess that I tried really hard to have at least one female speaker with us tonight, and I failed, which I don't know how to interpret. Probably a lack of network and relationship, but hopefully we will get better at that. So let's move to our next question from Jonathan Chow.
Hi, thank you. I have a brief question about regarding Jay's observation about Catholics in the pews not really wanting priests to talk about politics. And as a political scientist, I know like the line between what is political and not is often blurry, right? If you think about all the different issues that priests talk about from the pulpit. I was wondering if there's any data that exists polling Filipino Catholics about which issues they think clergy or other elements of the church or the church as a whole have competence to speak about, that they should be speaking about, and what issues they should not be speaking about. And I'll just I'll just leave it at that, if any data exists about that. Thank you.
Yeah, may I respond to that, Michelle? Yeah, good. Hi, Jonathan. Thank you so much. That's a great observation. Back in 2017, thereabouts. Yeah, I asked Pulse Asia, Ronnie Holmes to include this question in one of his surveys about the war on drugs. What should the Catholic Church do in response to the war on drugs? And then I listed down several options, and then people could choose up to 3, if I'm not mistaken. And I think the top answer, I'm looking at it right now, the top answer is to help with the rehabilitation of drug addicts. 58% of Filipinos said that that's what the Catholic Church should do. But the Catholic Church wasn't really known for that, even though we know at a level of parishes they were doing that. But instead, we know predominantly that the Catholic Church was making statements left and right about the war on drugs, or at least condemning the extrajudicial killings happening in their communities. But that act ranks only 3rd in the survey, with less than 50%, only 40% of Filipinos believing that should be the main response of the Catholic Church. So I think that that is already an indication of what Filipinos expect the Church to do in moments like this. And in some of my writings, I have also been very provocative about this, that maybe there are certain instances wherein the Church should not really say anything in public because it could only backfire. But instead demonstrate its alliances or or commitment to social justice by effectively working with communities, especially at the height of the war on drugs, because the war on drugs in particular was widely lauded, certainly by Filipinos and certainly by Catholics. So that's a tangential way of answering your question, that maybe it's not so much about the statements really that matter to Filipinos as it is what they feel that the church is doing when it comes to situations like this. Having said all of that, maybe there are also instances that the church can be very effective in. For example, when Kian de los Santos, the teenager who was whose death or whose murder was caught on camera back in 2017, parishioners in Caloocan, where Bishop Ambo David is bishop, rallied and had a massive gathering around his funeral, and at that time, the Catholic Church's voice became so prominent that even Duterte also had to say something, if I'm not mistaken. So if there are moments like that where the church could really provide a credible voice, because obviously somebody was murdered, then they could be very strategic with how they respond. Maybe that's how I would put it, Jonathan.
Thank you. If I may follow up briefly on that, that seems to suggest that the church would, the function of the church there is really just to draw, when there's a crisis to respond, as opposed to if I'm thinking about issues like, let's say, on climate change or on anti-human trafficking, like these are policy issues with political implications. But is there any sense that Filipinos understand, yes, the church should be involved or should not be involved in these particular issue areas?
Well, the immediate answer, at least based on my own work, is that no, whatever Laudato Si, for example, right? That was widely discussed among theological circles, among Catholic seminaries, but those conversations didn't trickle down to the communities unless the parish or the basic ecclesial community is very much involved in climate justice. We know that to be the case in certain dioceses or in certain parishes in areas that are vulnerable to disasters and all of that, certainly in the eastern part of the Philippines. But at the national stage, I think that's not very effective. And which is why I every time I have conversations with Catholic leaders, I would encourage them that maybe this is not really the time to speak from the national pulpit, but really to keep organizing communities at that level and engage them on issues that really matter to them. Climate justice is one of them in certain areas of the Philippines, but conflict does matter if you are in Mindanao, for example. Again, my work in these areas demonstrate that. So I think that is a nuanced answer to your question, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me move to the last written question we have. The last written question we have in the chat box first. So Jesse Matthewson.
Sorry, Mr. I wanted to alert you that Hansley is raising his hand, but you may want to call him later.
I thought to give a chance to Jesse Matthewson first, and then we come back to Hansley. Jesse Matthewson, would you like to unmute yourself?
Great, thanks. Yeah, so my question is really about what lies ahead for the church in the Philippines. I'm interested in what the impact is of the church having aligned itself with a candidate that lost by quite a convincing margin, both in terms of how it impacts the way people view the church and its relationship with the new government. Yeah, I know that's a little bit speculative, but I would love you to speculate about it.
Any speculator among us?
Jahil, go ahead.
No, thank you, Jesse. I think it's a question that I think all of us should be asking as well. I cannot speak on behalf of the Catholic Church, but I do know that they're very much concerned. And they're very much cautious about how they are to, the church leaders in particular, how they are to engage. For one or two reasons. The first reason is that they have gone through this already back in 1972 at a time when the church was predominantly, well, the church at the time in 1972 was very much divided. Some of them were very much supportive of the martial law, the others were in critical collaboration, the others were very critical, and then the others also supported the armed struggle. I suspect that this time, and we have also seen this in terms of the divided endorsements. While some priests really clearly endorsed Leni Robredo, others were also very much vocal about their support, or at least visually visible, with their support for Bongbong Marcos in the northern Philippines, for example. So the division is very much there, and I think the leadership will be very much cautious about how exactly to engage the regime. More so because they know that overwhelming majority of Filipinos supported Bongbong Marcos. I think they are now more concerned about because of what happened in the past 6 years, that every statement that they say may in fact backfire. They would be more cautious. But I think Professor Aguilar was spot on when he also said that part of the problem also has to do with the inability of certain influential leaders to understand where people are coming from. I have seen that even in my own research. Before I ventured into religion and politics, I was very much interested in youth religiosity. So I very much understand generational patterns and generational change. And back in the day when I was doing interviews with young people, they already told me, and this was 10 years ago, they already told me, they already questioned the church's position, for example, on the reproductive health bill. How come all these priests would always comment about their artificial contraceptives and so forth, as if they're not really concerned about the situation of poverty. I think fast track to 2022, I think similar questions are also being raised about how much of these, how much understanding do these priests and clergy really have about what is happening on the ground. Again, we saw that also with the war on drugs and so forth. So I think that's a very long answer, Jesse, to your question. I think the Catholic leaders are going to be very, very cautious. But just 30 more seconds, I think it's not so much the Catholic Church that is going to be playing a big role in the next 6 years. I think it's the emerging churches. Kiboloy's Church, the Kingdom of Jesus Christ, based in Davao, millions of followers, and then Iglesia ni Cristo. They're going to exercise their influence a lot more. I expect them to.
A short answer for me, Jesse. I think the Catholic Church hierarchy will be more concerned about its credibility and its role in politics more than people. People will not be concerned about how the church will position itself. It is a problem for the hierarchy. People, I think, see this as simply part of a series of events, and people have already, from the RH bill, etc., people have already, in a sense, they are not surprised. My guess, of course, I don't have the data. My guess is that this is not entirely surprising to them. It's part of a certain trend in their perception of how the Catholic Church acts in politics. And it will only confirm what they have always thought, that the church should not meddle in politics.
Thank you both. That was really helpful.
So we have 1 minute left. If there is any other comment on that question, or if Ansley would like to share his comments that he had earlier.
Yeah, this is technically a rejoinder to Dr. Chow's question earlier, but more regarding what exactly has been the engagement of the Philippine Church when it comes to politics. There's definitely, I'm getting the sense that there has been a gravitation towards pet projects for either the national hierarchy of the Philippine Catholic Church, as represented by the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines. But there's also an unwritten expectation that if there are local rights struggles in the provinces or outside the national capital, especially in the suburban and rural areas, there's an unwritten expectation that the Philippine Church is expected to support that, or at least give it hearing across its national platforms. The fact, however, that this is not consistent across all issues, and definitely it goes against the grain when it was mentioned when it comes to gender or sexuality issues. I'm guessing that is also why the inconsistency of the public's perception of the church's politics has become more and more apparent, that they're only progressive in some and not in others. And while the Philippine Catholic Hierarchy sees it as this is consistent with magisterium, this is consistent with the teachings of the Vatican and our doctrinal mandate, we have to acknowledge that it does have political implications, which they will have to respond to now. Apologies for hijacking the conversation, but thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Any response? Because it's almost time, so we will have to end soon. If no one wants to jump in, then I would like to conclude our roundtable and thank all of you, especially the speakers, for joining us tonight and sharing your insights and expertise on this very important and interesting event of the elections in the Philippines. This roundtable has been recorded and hopefully will be on YouTube soon for those who would like to check what we shared. For those who would like to stay in touch with ISAC, of course, visit our website, www.isac-research.org. And thank you again, and good night to all of you.